Hello, I'm Tom Bradby and welcome to Talking Politics. I'm joined, as always, by Robert and Anushka to discuss what has been a pretty relentless week of unwelcome headlines for Sir Keir Starmer, not least a backlash over his refusal to compensate the WASPy women and some more bad news on inflation. And Robert and Anushka are here. Look, I know we've had this debate before about saying one thing in opposition and doing another in government. And of course, it's easy to be sitting where we're sitting, right? It's easy to be a journalist, to ask the questions, to be irreverent or whatever.
It's easy to be in opposition.
It's easy to be in opposition. It's hard being in government. You can't give money to people without taking it off people, at least if you want to raise more taxes. It's hard. I get all that. But, why did they say it in opposition when they must have known that it was going to be hard to do in government? What do you both think?
I think there was a lot of stuff that they did in opposition whose consequences they didn't think through. I mean, essentially ruling out all sorts of tax rises felt good in the short term in terms of they felt it was going to help them win the general election. It's been, in my view, a bit of an economic disaster post-election, and this is in the same category. They thought it would get them some support and some nice warm feelings among a particular demographic, retired women, actually retired people in general. Which is why they, we showed on News at 10 last night, my little package, Keir Starmer saying, summer 2022, this is one of the great injustices. It's really important that it gets corrected. These were words that were popular at the time. Look, in fairness to Labour, by the time the campaign was in full swing, they didn't make a pledge in the manifesto to provide compensation.
Quite recent, though, 2022.
But the middle of 22 is recent enough. And then there are so many pictures of the Work and Pensions Secretary who, rather brutally announced yesterday, no money. There are photos of her standing with the WASPy women in opposition, supporting their cause. So it is a sort of say one thing in opposition, do something else as you point out, undermines trust, I think, a bit. I think the only other thing, which I think is really striking, I bet it'd be fascinating to see whether this changes much in the new year, is my goodness, they want all the bad news out fast, don't they?
I mean, that's totally deliberate. They're trying to get all the bad news out this year, and then they are hoping, although they can't say it for sure, that they don't have to come back and raise more money at a future date. But each one of these, I do think, blows trust, and I think even they know that trust is really important.
Even they know.
Well, look,
even they know. Even politicians understand that it's good if people trust you. I think in their minds, OK, we've had a bad, rocky start. They've particularly annoyed now WASPy women, farmers, all pensioners, quite a lot of businesses. They now think they have got time to rebuild that and to be in a position where, 4 years from now, people will be in different mindsets. I mean, even the ones which they think are most difficult, for example, farmers. I don't think Labour thinks they're about to, suddenly win over a huge amount of farmers in the next 4 years. But they still think that probably by that point, tax planning will have happened. People won't be feeling it quite so acutely as they're feeling it now. And presumably they think the same about this group of women, which is they'll have sort of come to terms with it by then. But each time they do it, it just affects people's trust.
I guess my thought would be, you have so much time in opposition to preparing government. I mean, what else are you doing? That's all you've got to do all day, because being in opposition...
But then there is this decision, right? How hard is it to win an election? We obviously had a row about this last week, so we don't need to have a row again. But how much do you have to do in opposition to win an election? How cynical do you have to be to win an election? We talk often about how in 2010 the Conservatives were honest about what they were going to do. They told us that austerity was coming, and then they brought in austerity. Well, they didn't win a majority in that election, actually. It was a minority government. As it happens, it became quite stable when they formed the coalition, but you don't really know what's going to happen. And I think, thinking as a politician rather than as we might as a journalist, they were convinced. You both disagree, but they were convinced that not making some of these promises would have really hit them at the
Let me ask a
ballot
different
box.
thing. I mean, you mentioned 2010. Obviously, Nick Clegg never recovered from the fact that he'd been seen with the posters saying no rises in tuition fees, and then he decided in government, I want to look like a grown-up. I need to look like a grown-up. The public finances are a mess. We just got to, we've just got to accept this. And George Osborne and David Cameron just couldn't believe that he'd done that because, it was...
There was so much he could have done to have avoided it.
So much, yeah.
I mean, yeah.
So I guess my question about this is, given what we were just saying, they're out there, they've publicly quoted, there's pictures of them with the WASPy women. Do we think this is really damaging, or do we actually think, being brutally honest, it'll pass quickly?
So I think the interesting comparison with Nick Clegg is when one talked to Nick Clegg, both in the immediate aftermath of that decision and then subsequently years later, what he always said is very much what Keir Starmer says about a whole raft of things that he's done, like which I think the most significant will inevitably turn out to be the increase in employers' national insurance, because the sums of money are so big and the impact of unemployment and living standards is so big. But there's a whole raft of things he's done that are unpopular. And in some of these cases, you might argue it with employers' national insurance, you might argue it with WASPy women. It seems to go against the things they said in opposition and therefore undermines trust. Nick Clegg said, it was the grown-up thing to do. The money wasn't there. I had to do it. It was for the good of the country. The British people never forgave him for it. They didn't buy you've got to be responsible in government. And this is what Starmer's doing. Starmer's doing all these things saying, you got to be responsible in government. It's the grown-up thing to do. Now, what failed to persuade the British people for Clegg may somehow work for Starmer. But there are, if I were close to Keir Starmer, I would find that analogy slightly chilling.
I mean, Nick Clegg is obviously the perfect example of what it can mean when you lose public trust to that degree. I do think there are some differences, one being that they were different political parties that came together to those who had voted for the Lib Dems from the left, and the Lib Dems had pitched in 2010 to the left. I was working at The Observer at the time, and I remember The Observer backed the Lib Dems, much to the anger of many people internally who wanted it to back Labour. The Guardian also backed the Lib Dems, and then felt somewhat betrayed when the Lib Dems did a deal with the Conservatives, which in hindsight people shouldn't have been, because the Lib Dems have a lot of Conservative-facing seats as well. It was more complicated. Tuition fees were sort of a wild thing for them to sign up to, given how bad it was. But also the additional thing, and Keir Starmer doesn't have this, is their coalition partners then went out to kill them. In 2015, I was on Cameron's bus, right? So I was with David Cameron all around the country, and it was completely brutal. We spent like 90% of the time I was on that bus, we were in Lib Dem seats in the southwest, including we went repeatedly to Vince Cable's seat in Twickenham, we went repeatedly to David Law's seat in Yeovil, and I said to David Cameron, these guys propped you up in government. You're going quite hard after them. And he was like, yeah, and we're going to beat them. And it was that brutal. And so although I don't think this trust stuff I think it is a big problem for Keir Starmer, and I think it will be remembered at the next election. I think two things. I think the anger is not quite as visceral as it was over tuition fees. I mean, that was something else.
Or not yet, anyway.
Not yet. And secondly, they don't have that added fun of a coalition partner that's out to kill them at the end of the process.
I would say, as we close out this year, that probably people are pretty annoyed with the government and a little bit disappointed, but it's a bit skin deep. They're not like really annoyed. They could probably get over it. Would you agree with that, or do you think I'm deluded and the damage is already more than I'm allowing for?
I think these things are quite hard to be confident about, but the important factor is that although they've got this huge majority in the House of Commons, their share of the vote is, by historical standards, low. right? So if you've only got 1 in 5 people in the country voting for you, 34% of those who voting for you, even quite mild disappointment is a problem. Because, some of those, it doesn't take many of those people to be fed up and can't be bothered to vote for you ever again for what was a landslide to become at best a hung parliament and at worst a loss. So, it's a problem for them.
Well, it was the final PMQs of 2024 today, and Kemi Badenoch rounded off the year with a series of questions about how the Prime Minister's policies will affect pensioners.
For years, the Prime Minister and his cabinet played politics with the WASPy women. The Deputy Prime Minister said Conservatives were stealing their pensions. She promised to compensate them in full. Another broken promise. Now they admit we were right all along. But let's ask about another group of pensioners whose trust... Let's ask about another group of pensioners whose trust was broken. Since the Chancellor cut winter fuel payments, how many extra people have applied for pension credit?
Mr. Speaker, the number one job of this government was to put the finances back in order after the last government lost control. They left a £22 billion black hole, and we had to take tough choices. We made sure the most vulnerable pensioners do get the winter fuel payment, and we have been encouraging and driving up eligibility for pension credit. So saying up to their entitlement, and she should join that campaign.
Energy bills are increasing, despite his promise to cut them by £300. In Scotland, his party leader wants to restore the winter fuel payments. Across England, councils are scrabbling together funds for struggling pensioners. The tragic reality this Christmas is pensioners will suffer and may even die as a result of this cruel policy. Did the Chancellor consider the impact on councils and on the NHS, or does she just not know what she's doing?
The Household Support Fund was set out in the budget. She knows that. We're pushing up pension credit. But she now says they are committed to the triple lock. Her shadow chancellor says they're not, that it's unsustainable. Maybe over a sandwich or a steak they could sort it out and come back and tell us what their policy actually is.
To lead with Liberal Democrats, Red David.
I've had the great joy of spending time recently with some amazing young people from the Bath Philharmonia Young Carers Choir. They're a brilliant example of the power of music to make a difference in young people's lives. One member of the choir, Caitlin, has even developed a special new project to spread the joy of music to young people in our schools and communities. So will the Prime Minister meet Caitlin to hear more about her exciting project and work with us and others to support music in our schools and communities?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I welcome his comments, and as he will know, today we're introducing the landmark Children's Wellbeing Bill to enable all children to succeed, including young carers. That increased the pupil funding premium to over £2.9 billion, which can be used to support pupils with identified needs, and that, of course, includes carers. And now young carers are on the school census, as he knows, that's since 2023. They have greater visibility, and schools will be better able to identify and support them. Mr. Speaker, he talks of singing. There was carols outside our front door on Monday, and my family was surprised to see the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, shamelessly plugging his song. We have strict rules about antisocial behaviour, but in the spirit of the season, I simply say Happy Christmas.
So in addition to the measures that the Prime Minister just talked about, will he support the Carers Trust's Young Carers Covenant to make sure across government, across local authorities, we are supporting these young people with all the support they deserve?
We should support these young people, and we continue to work across the sector to ensure all schools identify, support and record data on young carers. And of course, Mr. Speaker, we boosted the carers allowance in the budget. But I agree with him in relation to these young carers.
Mother of the House, Diane Abbott.
The WASPy women fought one of the most sustained and passionate campaigns for justice that I can remember, year in, year out. We did promise them that we would give them justice. I understand the issue about the cost, but does the Prime Minister really understand how let down WASPy women feel today?
I do understand the concern, of course I do. I set out the history, Mr. Speaker, but the research is clear that 90% of those impacted did know about the change. And in those circumstances, the taxpayer simply can't afford the burden of tens of billions of pounds of compensation. But I do understand the concern.
Kemi Badenoch versus Keir Starmer. I think we've established that that is not box office. And again, it was not box office. I'm going to express a controversial opinion.
No.
Yeah, go on. It's the end of the year. I feel I can. Ed Davey is really growing on me as leader of the Lib Dems. Now, let me set out my case. I thought he was a bit of a wally in the election campaign with all that ridiculous stuff. But that sort of grew on me. And then there was the kind of party political broadcast about his family situation, which was, I don't think I've ever cried in a party political broadcast before, but I thought that was immensely moving. And actually, he asks really intelligent questions. They're not predictable. They're quite often on issues. You're looking at me really blankly, the pair of you. If you're listening to this, I'm getting really blank looks.
I think you're a bit late to the Ed Davey party. I mean, not that we're in it, but I think the Ed Davey party has sort of happened, and people thought that was all quite impressive in the end, however silly it looked at the time.
But he's like thoughtful, and he doesn't always ask the obvious question, and he actually seems to raise things that he genuinely wants answers to. Look, I know Kemi Badenoch's got a different job, and she has to sort of stand up and hold the government to account, and that pressure isn't on him. But I don't know, there's something about him that just impresses me a little bit more
got over
each
the loss
week.
of Stephen Flynn as the...
Well, Stephen Flynn is also pretty good, I have to say. He was, Anyway, what do you both think? Fair summary of Ed Davey, or am I overrating?
I mean, look, I think when he was elected as leader, expectations were low, and he's massively outperformed what I think almost any, I think even most Lib Dem members would have expected. He is thoughtful. Look, I personally find the jokes cringe-making, but...
Well, they are.
He's going to be like your embarrassing uncle, isn't he? I mean, that's literally the strategy, I think.
Yeah.
Who you quite like.
Yeah.
But as you say, he's a thoroughly, as far as one can tell, and sometimes you find out things later on that you didn't know, but he just seems a thoroughly decent human being.
Well, then
the story of his childhood, the story of, how he, his current family life. He's had enormous burdens to carry his entire life, but he's carried them off apparently with good humour, a sense of duty. He seems like a very impressive person.
I mean, we shouldn't forget that he's had some political difficulties in the past, right? He was the post office minister.
Yep.
He didn't, have the
He wasn't on the ball for the post office.
He wasn't on the ball, and that was quite a major thing. But what they wanted to do was change that impression of him as Sir Hypocrite, I think the Evening Standard called him, to something A, soft and cuddly, and then quite serious when it came to the social care and health issue. They did it incredibly well. Like Labour, they had the massive help of the Conservatives kind of collapsing, all over the country, and that really helped the Lib Dems. Nevertheless, it was an absolutely stunning election result for them. And the thing I know what you mean. Obviously, it is a bit unpredictable. He does ask about different things, but I think we can expect him for the first half of this Parliament to focus very heavily on health and social care as the issues he wants changes.
Which he does with intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah, but it is fair to raise the post office because that's such a terrible thing, and that does stand on his record.
It is difficult for them because they want to attack Labour on certain points, and they have done on farmers because obviously they represent a lot of rural seats, and they have done on national insurance. But they also kind of don't want to attack Labour too much because they are Tory-facing in pretty much all their seats now. And so it makes it a slightly easier job for him in there because unlike Kemi Badenoch, who's up against Keir Starmer, in a way, Ed Davey is up against Kemi Badenoch and so can have a bit more fun with it.
Yeah. I think Keir Starmer, sometimes I think he is getting a bit better.
I think personally,
he's a bit more relaxed.
I think he's getting better in terms of his delivery at PMQs, in terms of coming back on answers. It's not going to take away our frustrations of not actually answering the question.
Or constantly banging on about the £22 billion black hole. You know, we should
also
take a bet for the first Prime Minister's questions that the £22 billion black hole does not make an appearance. Is it 26? Is it 27? Is it just before the election in 28?
2030.
But he did something sort of akin to, the 22 billion strategy today when it came to defending himself on not giving a penny to the WASPy women, which did in the end. I thought Kemi Badenoch's position was weird. To attack him for agreeing with the Tory party on WASPy women seemed
and then move on to a different issue.
Very odd. It didn't. I don't think it worked at all. But a number of left-wingers did stand up, and both from the Labour Party and I think the SNP also attacked him over not giving compensation to the WASPy women, these women born in the 1950s. So I was very struck that his sole justification, he basically said in Parliament, yes, they had a case, yes, I feel very sorry for them, but then he kept saying it'll cost us tens of billions of pounds to compensate them. That is not what the Ombudsman was recommending. The Ombudsman was saying up to 10 billion. Right, might have been a third of that on one of the if the lower threshold that the Ombudsman recommended had been adopted. It was not tens of billions, and he constantly said tens of billions. And this kind of alarmism, I just think it's self-defeating. It just because people know it's not true.
One thing I wanted to say about Kemi Badenoch, which is just this is really like Beltway in a weed stuff, but I just thought I would mention it whilst I was hearing what you were saying there, and that is. She doesn't seem to have learned yet that she doesn't necessarily have to worry about what her position or her party's position is or was. Really, she only needs to question him about the difference between what his position was and what his position is.
She can be totally cynical. Don't worry about it.
Well, no, it's not being totally cynical. It's just saying, my job is to question you. I am the leader of the opposition. My job is to hold you to account for the people.
She did say something at the end, which, I sort of agree with this sort of starting on the WASPy women and then turning to a different issue, which is what she did last week as well, was a little bit odd. I still think winter fuel payments are a problem for Labour, particularly as we're getting into the depths of winter, and I think, therefore, not a bad area for her to be on. But she did say something at the end, which I do think strikes a chord with everything we've been saying, which is maybe he should have a New Year's resolution of telling the truth. And the reality is, if you've promised things in opposition that you're now saying you're unable to do, then that is going to strike a chord with some people. He's obviously making the argument when we came in it was different to what we thought. But that's not entirely true.
There's this sort of weird paradox about Starmer. So in the last government, I did think the Tories were mad to attack him for changing his position very significantly over the course of the last Parliament, from the more left-wing position he was elected on through to a position that he thought was going to make him electable when the election finally came. I just thought all the Tories are then saying to voters is, look, this guy, you thought he was unreasonable before, but now he's very reasonable. And they were sort of doing him a favour. I have to say, post-election, I think the so-called honesty problem is more serious for him. Because I think at that point, voters say, hang on a second, we thought we understood you, we voted you in on one basis, and at the end of the day, I do think the fact that he had the opportunity, to go back to a conversation we have repeatedly, he had the opportunity before the election to say, I am inheriting a black hole and we are going to have to put taxes up to give you the priorities you want, which is a better health service. He rejected what was the economically honest thing to do. Also, in my view, I think you and I agree about this, Anushka doesn't. I also think the politically more sensible thing to do. He rejected it, and that's why he's got this massive trust problem.
Let's move on to talking about inflation, higher than we thought it was going to be. I guess that means interest rates aren't coming down, but also it's a good moment to talk about where we think we are on the economy. I hear kind of totally different things anecdotally as we run up to Christmas. Some people say it's going okay, some people say it's very sticky. You know, I mean, what do you both feel about where we are going into next year?
Just in a nutshell, this is really a problem for the government at the moment because we've got no growth. That's what the last 2 months' data show, and we've got rising inflation. For any government, that is the worst combination, because it does say to you that any stimulus that the Bank of England might give is going to be delayed. We saw wage data earlier this week which showed wages rising again, and today we saw inflation higher than almost everybody had been expecting. Not massively higher, but higher than people were expecting. In normal circumstances, when you've had, when it's obvious that the economy is stagnating, you would expect the Bank of England to bring down interest rates earlier, but they won't now, because of their primary responsibility is to put a lid on inflation. And so, as I say, if you happen to be in elected office, this is a particular nightmare, particularly when almost everybody says part of that stagnation is because you've been too gloomy.
How much do you think their gloominess really feeds into that?
So I think some of it does. I think, if you talk to businesses ahead of the budget, they delayed investments because of their concerns about tax changes. Post-budget, a lot of businesses are squeezed by especially that rise in the employer's national insurance. And again, they're deferring investments. Businesses I talk to at the moment are pretty gloomy, right?
And it does mean that wages, whilst growth might be better now, may be worse next year because the OBR thinks that most of this increase in employer NICs is going to be passed on into slower wage growth. I mean, I think America's really interesting on all of this because, in America there was this argument, well, macroeconomic terms, we're doing quite well. Why are people not thanking us for that? And the reason they weren't thanking them for that is the thing they cared about more than anything else was inflation. And inflation was the thing that affected them in their everyday lives. And the other bit that also affects people is their rates, because especially if they've got mortgages, we saw what happened after Liz Truss. And it seems, as Robert was saying, at the moment, you've got the worst of all worlds, which is there's no macroeconomic story to tell, and things aren't getting easier personally either.
And this is something you're much closer to than I am, but I was quite struck again in PMQs. I think it was a Tory MP who was complaining that his council was about to put up council tax by some astronomical amount. We're going to see that across the country, and that's straight out of people's pockets.
Yeah, council tax massively affects people at the same time as your services are not getting any better because councils are still facing a financial crisis, basically.
That is all for this week. Thanks very much for joining us. Remember, you can watch episodes of Talking Politics on YouTube or ITVX, or listen back on your favourite podcast platform. We'll be back with one more episode before the new year, full of predictions. But for now, goodbye.